Hello, thanks for joining me on this week's 172nd Air Wing video. Today we have for review the MiG-29A Fulcrum. Turns out I've got a few of these in the collection, and you all will be seeing them come on the channel in the coming weeks and months, and I thought it, with recent developments, rather appropriate to start the MiG-29 series with probably the most actively used ones at the moment, which are in the colors of the Ukrainian Air Force. I'll take a moment here and recognize something. At this point, it's been over a year since Putin escalated the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which properly started in 2014, and of course was most recently escalated in 2022. So at the time of this video, it's going to be spring of 2023 shortly, and I want to take a moment and recognize that coming from an American perspective, it's not common that we Americans have reason to be proud of our foreign policy. In fact, most of the time when you look at things that America does overseas, we generally end up being either the bad guys, or we try to do something good, but it just doesn't work out. And the latest example of that would be the absolutely atrocious situation of how Afghanistan came to a close. So it's rare that as an American, I personally can look at something we're doing overseas and take it with a measure of pride. So often with foreign policy and the allies we support and the decisions that Washington, D.C. makes, I'm just left to scratch my head and nurse a stiff beverage or two at the aftermath. But with Ukraine, I'm glad to say that, well, at least we're doing something right. We're helping people that are helping themselves, and I just want to take a moment and recognize that even though the active press has, of course, moved on to bigger and better things that generate more attention, like whatever some celebrity tweeted about, or some such thing, just for the Ukrainians watching this and for the Russians who oppose what their leader in Moscow is doing, I want to take a moment here and recognize that America supports Ukraine in this, and as an American, I'm proud of that. It's something that we can look upon and actually recognize that we're backing our values for a change, instead of backing some military initiative meant to funnel money into some Wall Street associate of whoever is in charge in Washington at the particular moment. So that is not to say, of course, that the situation in Ukraine is free of corruption, and that American assistance thereof is not above oversight or any of those sorts of things. But again, it's good to see that we're spending our taxpayers' money on an initiative involving a war that's actually beneficial to people who deserve and need our help. And that is a fact that is worth recognizing at this juncture, a year past the latest escalation of the Russo-Ukraine war. So, on that heady note, we will pivot to the topic at hand, which is the MiG-29 Fulcrum. This aircraft has been around for quite some time. It actually started off as a proposal by the Soviet Council of Ministers and General Staff in 1971. So in 1969, the American F-15 Eagle was approved for production, and this development scared the Soviet aviation establishment in much the same way that their MiG-25 had done to the American aeronautical establishment about a decade or so earlier. So the concern from the Soviet side of the equation was, if the American government was fielding an advanced air superiority fighter, the Soviet government, of course, needed something to counter this. So the General Staff issued a requirement to generate what was called the next generation tactical fighter, or in the Russian parlance, the PFI. The Advanced Tactical Fighter program was specified to do basically everything. It was supposed to have Mach 2 speed, heavy weaponry, agile maneuverability, short field takeoff, meaning the ability to take off and recover from short or unimproved fields, and it had to have the ability to carry long range, beyond visual range weaponry, as in air-to-air missiles, which can be employed using radar-guided systems beyond the pilot's ability to visually identify a target. Very ambitious stuff for a Soviet engineering establishment that had just created the MiG-29 flogger. So as time went on, it was realized in the early 1970s that building one airplane to do all of this was not going to be a feasible engineering achievement. And so the Soviet PFI project was broken into two separate initiatives. The PFI would continue as the heavy air superiority fighter, and that project would be fulfilled in the form of the Sukhoi 27 flanker, which is a discussion and review that I have already put on the channel as of the 1st of 2023, and that was also my first Ukrainian Air Force model review of this year. So if you would like to know more about the flanker and how that fits into the story, feel free to pause here and check out that video and that review. So the other project, which was broken out, was the lightweight fighter program, or the LPFI. And the LPFI would maintain the need for short field performance and long range weaponry and agility, but the lightweight tactical fighter would have a shorter range and a shorter engagement envelope. So the principle was the lightweight tactical fighter would operate relatively close to the front line of a combat zone, in the Soviets' case an imagined conflict with NATO, and this lightweight fighter would take off relatively close to the front lines, engage and establish air superiority over that front line, and recover at a short range field near the battle space. So in essence, it was supposed to be something of a mix between an F-16 and an A-10, in that the A-10 is designed to be used relatively close to the front line, but the F-16 is of course meant to be a lightweight air superiority fighter. And naturally, the F-16 doesn't necessarily do that mission. It's mostly applied to the air-to-ground role, at least for the US Air Force. But we will leave the digression here and return to the cool MiG-29 Fulcrum. So when the requirements were updated for the lightweight fighter program in 1971, the Mikoyan and Gurevich Bureau moved forward with the design that we generally see here. And the MiG-29 took its first prototype flight in 1977 and was slated to replace the MiG-23 flogger as the frontline combat air power example for the Warsaw Pact and Soviet-aligned countries. So the MiG-29 would go on to serve multiple countries involved in the Soviet bloc, at one point, of course, also including Ukraine, who inherited a large force of MiG-29s when the Soviet Union dissolved in the 1990s. And so the force of MiG-29s still continues to this day in service with Ukraine, and we will revisit the subject of the future of this aircraft a little bit later in today's video. So the MiG-29 carries two kinds of air-to-air missiles, and apparently has been engineered to carry the AGM-88 anti-radiation missile. But the weapons it was originally designed to use were the Soviet-built R-73, which is a air-to-air infrared missile similar in nature to a Sidewinder, although featuring off-bore sight capability. And the missile I am pointing to here is an R-70, it's an R-27. So the R-27, as modeled here, is the radar-guided version. They also made them in an infrared-guided format. And the R-27 Alamo has a maximum range of about 40 miles. So essentially, it is the Soviet block answer to the Raytheon AIM-7 Sparrow. Much like the AIM-7 Sparrow, the R-27 must be guided by a launching airplane. So a MiG-29 firing an R-27 in the radar-guided mode must keep its nose pointed at the engaged target to score a kill. Up here in the nose, we have a little bulbous deal right here, and that is the shketel. I may be mispronouncing that, but it is the optical tracking system which is tied to the pilot's helmet. So decades before the fielding of the off-boresight AIM-9X Sidewinder, the Soviet Union fielded the off-boresight R-73 OLS guided system, which means that wherever the pilot looks within about a 60-degree angle off of the nose, they can point their eyes to the target, cue up an R-73 or an R-27 infrared guided missile and launch it. I suppose in theory one could queue up a radar guided R-27 too with the system, but that would be a very strange tactical situation to use a long range radar guided missile in a close range visual fight of such a nature. But theoretically, as I understand the MiG-29's systems, that could be done. So we also see here that there's this big bulbous silver/gray thing in the middle of the fuselage, and that is the external fuel tank. One of the aspects of the MiG-29 which has hobbled its appeal to export customers is its relatively short range. Now, again, going back to the original LPFI requirements from the early 1970s, the Soviet General Staff did not plan for the MiG-29 to be a long-range tactical fighter, which was a role, of course, reserved for the Su-27 flanker. So because of that, long fuel range was not part of the design specification for this MiG-29, and unfortunately, that has crippled it to some extent because Mikoyan has spent the last 20-odd years coming up with ways of increasing the fuel and efficiency of the aircraft. So some of the later MiG-29 variants have a bigger back. I'll talk to some of this a little bit more when I get to a review of an earlier specification MiG-29, but the ones the Ukrainians use do feature a larger spine, slightly larger spine from the original MiG-21-12 specification, and that is to include more avionics and slightly more fuel, which is incidentally also why you will very rarely see an operational MiG-29 flying without one of these fuel tanks in the middle installed. So with the fuel tank, if the pilot is careful about judiciously managing their throttle of their twin Tumansky engines, they'll probably manage a decent patrol. But as Ukrainian pilot Juice put it in one of the interviews he has done, it is possible for a pilot to run the fuel on a MiG-29 without the fuel tanks dry in 12 minutes at full afterburner. So that's pretty thirsty airplane. So that's always been the drawback of the MiG-29, and if DCS gameplay is any indication, I have to hand my kudos to the Ukrainian Air Force pilots for making this bird work, because yeah, if you're not careful with flying this thing, you will burn all your gas in that game like that. So on that note, then, we will pivot to the topic of Ukrainian service and how the Fulcrum has played a role here. So the Fulcrum is an aircraft that's optimized for the air-to-air equivalent of home defense, and in that role, it's done a fairly decent job. Naturally, at this juncture in 2023, we do not have confirmed numbers available for kill versus loss ratios. But I imagine as time goes on and this conflict is concluded, there will be, of course, professional analytical research into the numbers, And as time goes on, we will, of course, get more publications and corroborating information. So we'll be able to talk to some of those numbers as time goes on. Right now, it's simply too early to know for sure. So we do know that there have been some kills of MiG-29s. MiG-29s, Ukrainian Service have taken down some Russian aircraft in the earlier phases of the escalation in 2022, I should say. And we also know that the Russian MiG-31s, which have been launching long-range axe-head missile attacks from over 50 miles, firing their missiles at long range from safer territory. They've also scored some kills. As I understand it, those have been against Su-25 ground attack airplanes, but again, we'll know if the MiG-29s ever got mixed up with it. So again, in one of his interviews, Ukrainian Air Force pilot Juice mentioned that the long-range axe-head missile employed by the Russian Foxbats, the MiG-31s, was quote-unquote fucking dangerous. So we will take his word on that as we discuss the next steps for the MiG-29. I think for, at least from information available right now, the MiG-29 is doing a good job for the Ukrainians, but it is hobbled by the fact that its radar and its missiles are of Russian manufacturer and of relatively short range, which means the Ukrainians do not have a capability of challenging something like a Su-35 or a MiG-31 at long range, because both of those Russian aircraft, of course, field longer range missiles like the R-77, and more importantly, those longer range R-77s can independently home in on a target. So the Ukrainian pilot to launch their R-27s, pictured here, they would have to keep their nose pointed while shooting, whereas the Russian antagonists can launch their missile and leave, literally. So that is, of course, a major strategic disadvantage in an air combat scenario. So it looks like the Ukrainian MiG-29s have been keeping busy knocking down drones and cruise missiles, which is probably a more valuable mission than taking on Russian airplanes in one-on-one combat. Obviously, that would sell more movie tickets in the inevitable diorama or documentary / movie, however you want to put it, whatever media is going to be released about this war in the coming years once it's concluded. But keeping cruise missiles from killing families, women and children in high rises and in their farms, that's a much more important mission to do. And the MiG-29 is relatively well suited for doing this. With a 30mm cannon, short range infrared R-73s, it can do the job pretty well, keeping and knocking down Iranian Shahed drones and other various detritus that has no business in Ukrainian airspace. So we'll see what the future holds. Just understand, of course, that right now there's a lot of blog talk about the Ukrainians upgrading to F-16s, but it should be noted that due to the extensive logistics required to train their people and how to maintain it, how to fly it, and how to fight with it, transitioning from one airplane to another, especially from a Soviet bloc platform to a Western one, it is not an overnight transition. Such a thing takes years to do, and to do it properly, to gain the experience in the airplane, to actually fight with it, still more time than that. I'll just say right now, as somebody who plays DCS, which is a game, okay, so we're not even looking at the same level of complexity as, say, training for combat. Learning a video game airplane in that game is in-depth enough that it takes months to do it. If you're dedicated and that's all you do, you probably could learn the basics on something like an F5 module in DCS in a matter of maybe a few weeks, maybe a week. But being able to employ the missiles, the bombs, to fly and fight with it and that sort of thing, that takes substantially more time. And it's not something you want to rush, especially when you're looking at the prospect of it being very difficult to recruit and train pilots in the current operational wartime circumstance, because those are aircraft and fuel and resources which need to be used in the actual war effort. So any discussion of F-16s and Western fighters and Eurofighters and that kind of thing, it's not as simple as just swapping out, say, a Russian AK-47 for a shiny M16 or European, L-87 rifle. I mean, you're talking about substantial changes to a country's infrastructure, training, and service maintenance and procedures and that sort of thing. So again, it's not the kind of task that's going to happen instantaneously, even in a detailed simulation level video game, to say nothing of real life. So for the current conflict, the MiG-29 Fulcrums will of course continue, but it'll be interesting to see how Ukraine navigates the coming years and what aircraft they will choose to reinforce their air force once hostilities here cease, and in all likelihood, Putin is doing something else for a living, or potentially not living at all. We'll see what the Russian political environment looks like in the coming months. So we'll leave that happy subject and talk about something a bit better, and that is the model itself here. So this is, of course, by HobbyMaster. This is a unique situation because the MiG-29 is a model in 1/72nd scale, which is available in multiple configurations from multiple manufacturers. I happen to have another one from JC Wings, which I will again be putting on the channel to discuss, and there will be a head-to-head between the HobbyMaster and the JC Wings, so that will be a future video as well. But I have to say that I do like what HobbyMaster has done here. There are some aspects I would like to see improved, but we'll start with the positives. So the overall shape is good. I like the fact that HobbyMaster did account for the different spine configurations in the MiG-29s, because the earlier versions have a much thinner spine versus the later ones, which were upgraded with more fuel. So those differences are captured between the variants as well as the countries that operate them. And I'm glad to see that HobbyMaster has paid attention to that detail. The detail on the RD-33 engines, especially in the afterburner cans, is really well done. Would have liked to see the inside painted black instead of the generic gray that seems to come on all of the HobbyMaster engine colors, but that is admittedly a bit of a nitpick. I do like the fact that the detail is visible and prominent, and that is something to praise them for. The detail on the weapons, such as the R-73s and the R-27s, are really well done. There's no messy paint on the missiles, there's no sloppiness there, and the missile pylons fit into the wing with no need for shimming or sanding down or modification. And the same also goes for the fuel tank as well. So glad to see that the accessories that come with the model are well done. On this release, you get the landing gear doors, 2 R-73s per wing, so 4 R-73s total, and 2 R-27s. And remember, the R-27s are the bigger missiles here, and the other one on the other side. So the paint detail is really well done. I do like the fact that the digital color scheme is rendered relatively accurately. There's maybe 1 or 2 spots where they could have probably cleaned things up, but again, that's verging in the nitpicking territory. All things considered, I like the digital scheme, and as sharp as it looks in this video, it is much sharper in person. Hopefully, the upgrade I made to the camera suite here and recording it 4K helps communicate that a bit, but again, it's very sharp when you look at it in person. And I do love the fact that HobbyMaster has gotten the details right there with no blotches or paint imperfections there. So another thing I will praise them for are the small parts fit. So with the JC Wings, I'll just say it here, you'll hear it in the comparison video too. There are a lot of little parts, and you have to fit them in a very specific order, or when you put the last part in, you're going to knock out something you put in before, and then you're just going to be frustrated. So HobbyMaster's integration of the landing gear and the landing gear doors is much better done, in my opinion, here. Do note that the side doors are a little bit fussy. That's why I haven't pushed it all the way in. You can, but I don't want to test it because shortly I'm going to put the main landing gear back on when I display it on the ground. So I don't want to risk breaking it, pulling it out so soon while I'm shooting the video, but you can push that all the way in and it'll be flush fit just like it's supposed to. So just bear that in mind when you're looking at this shot here. And the pilot detail is actually really well done for a HobbyMaster release. Usually the pilot is basically an afterthought, but not for this release, and I'm glad to say that. So bravo. HobbyMaster also got the angle on the vertical stabilizers correct, because they're supposed to be canted about 6 degrees from the center line, so they are not straight up like you would see on the JC wings example. These are canted, again, 6 degrees, and that is the proper configuration. So once again, bravo to HobbyMaster for doing that. And that's a good point to pivot to a negative on the model, which is that the horizontal stabilizers here, as well as the vertical stabilizers, while they are canted at an accurate angle, do not try to handle the model from that position. I will say that again. Do not try to pull the model out of the box or handle it with these vertical stabilizers, because they are plastic, which is actually a good thing, probably because it keeps the weight of the model balanced, so it's not tail heavy or weird to position. As you can see from the earlier shot I did in the intro, you can position this on a caliber wing stand, or router style stand, whether it's from Caliber or somewhere else. You can position it fairly easily to any roll you want, including straight up standing on its tail, which I think would be rather difficult if these parts were metal. The detail probably would also be a bit difficult, because the JC wings ones are metal, and you can see they're kind of unrealistically thick at certain angles. But in defense of using the metal parts, you can handle the JC wings model with the vertical stabs, and it's not a problem. The fact that they're, of course, incorrectly canted is a concern. But coming back to the HobbyMaster here, these are correctly canted, but you don't want to do that, because these are plastic, and you will unfortunately risk breaking these off if you are not careful in handling the MiG-29 from HobbyMaster. So just try to handle it from the wings or from the fuselage, because these parts are metal, and the wing is especially very stout. So just bear that in mind. Another drawback is the front intakes. On the JC wings release, you get intake doors which go in here. There's no instructions on how to put them in correctly, which is a little frustrating, but on the JC wings you get doors which block these off, and that is correct, because when the MiG-29 is on the ground, the intake doors come down and cover these up, and that is to avoid the ingestion of foreign object debris into the intakes, because foreign object debris does not mix with jet engines. It's a great way to ruin a very expensive piece of equipment, and nobody involved in aviation liked that. So the front doors come down and block these off. So when the MiG-29 is on the ground, when the weight on wheels is detected, these are blocked off, and the engine draws its intake air from auxiliary vents on top of the leading edge root extensions on each side. So those are closed on the HobbyMaster model here. So if you want to present this accurately, you basically have to display it in the air, because if you put it on the ground, these are going to be open, which is not correct unless the aircraft is completely powered down. Once the airplane has power, the doors close, and then these open up, and then that is the configuration until the aircraft rotates for takeoff. Once it's off the wheels and it's gained forward flight, the intake doors come away, and then the engine draws its air from the front like you would normally expect, and of course then it performs as a regular aircraft from there. So it would have been nice to see that. What I may end up doing is taking some cardstock and painting it slate gray. I'm assuming it's some kind of a slate gray or a navy gray to match this, and I'll just make my own basically to block those off when I present it on the ground for my own display. But just something to note. To me, it's not a major concern. It's easy for me to just make like a cardboard one, again, out of cardstock, and just paint it. But just bear in mind that you're not going to get those covers with this release, unlike the JC wings. So those are the nitpicky ones. Honestly, all things considered, I think it's a great model. And another reason why I advise that you pick this up is because, given the situation in Ukraine, these are not going down in value. So right now, they are still decently available. I think you can hop onto any retailer and purchase one for between 120 and 140 US dollars. But if you're watching this in proximity to March of 2023, don't wait. If you are interested in one of these, get it now, because I suspect if you wait much longer, they will sell out relatively quickly, and then you will be paying a premium to get it in your collection. So I was surprised to notice, well, maybe surprised is the wrong word, maybe just taken aback to notice that an earlier, the Blue 58 release that I did a review on earlier this year, the Ukrainian Su-27, is now up to over $200 on eBay. So don't wait. If you like this and you're watching this in proximity to March 2023, don't delay. Pick this up before you're looking at $200, $300. And if you don't like it for some reason, you can probably sell it private party and get all your money back, and potentially then some, depending on the economic circumstance. So, which I don't know. I think if you're going to spend the money to get this in your collection, you're probably not going to let it go. I certainly won't. So, I'm glad to have it here, and hopefully the nice folks in Ukraine keep up the fight. And with that, we will conclude the review here. So I endorse it. Again, I will make a point here that the models that I do reviews for, they are not sponsored by a retailer or another business entity. These are all my personal items in my personal collection that I've paid for with my own personal money. So bear that in mind when you're looking at these. I'm not going to necessarily say too many bad things about them because, well, I paid for it, right? So I'm not going to order a model I think is going to look bad. So, you know, unless I'm, get a sponsorship, which is very unlikely, I guess, but, you know, that's probably not going to change. So, again, I'm glad to have it in my collection. And if you want to see future content, I would consider subscribing. This way you'll be notified when I upload my newest video. I'm looking at maintaining a schedule of uploading new content every Sunday morning. So if you're subscribed, you will have a notification that I have a new video, and you will see that and be able to click it. So as of this time, I have over 60 other model review videos on my channel. So if there's another airplane that you like, I probably have either one of those on the review or something similar that you probably are into. So check those out, and feel free to leave your questions and comments below on this MiG-29. I'm curious, those of you who have purchased one of these, do you like it? I just want to get your guys' perspective on how much you like your Ukrainian MiG-29s, and you know, whether you'll be getting the future release that's coming up, because HobbyMaster will be releasing another one of these with the HARM missile in place of the R-27, which is going to be cool. So how many of you are planning on getting one of those? Just want to hear from the group on that. So on that note, we will wrap things up here. Thank you all for watching, and thank you all for subscribing. And hopefully this video finds you in a positive place. And to our Ukrainian allies, Slava Ukraini.